Hello and welcome to this little video on ideas for good language teaching. In this presentation I will present to you some different ideas and suggested principles for how we can teach English in appropriate ways in Norway. And I'll start with the principles or the suggestions that Nation makes concerning what language teaching ideally should consist of. And I have presented this to you before and just go quickly through it here. Nation talks about the importance of meaning-focused input, that we provide a lot of reading material and a lot of listening material that the pupils can relate to, that they find meaningful. Also that they are exposed to, or that they have to work with meaning-focused output, meaning writing and speaking. And also that they are allowed to work with grammar and other types of language-focused learning. And finally, that they are allowed to work on developing their fluency. Now, Judith Linton also has some interesting ideas about this, and she says that as teachers we should take notice to focus on the individual learner rather than on our teaching method. After all, it's the learning of each pupil which should be the central focus, not us as teachers or the methods that we use. And she also points to the importance of teachers reflecting on what they're doing in the classroom, to reflect on what they're doing and to think about how can things be improved, what am I doing well, what should I improve. And she also focuses on a learner-centered approach. That means to let the pupils take charge of their own learning processes, that they understand what they're doing, they understand the goals, they try to make out their own current level of proficiency, and that they can work to improve their proficiency without the teacher always being involved. Then she points to the importance of assessment for learning, which I suppose that you know a lot about already, but we will come back to formative assessment or assessment for learning in later videos, so we can work more with it specifically related to English. And then she talks about the potential usefulness of digital resources, that we can use digital resources wisely and critically, but hopefully in ways that promote learning in good ways. And then there is something which many teachers who have been teaching English have found very useful, and this is the 12 principles of good teaching and learning that Munden and Myhre promote. And the first one is what they call teaching English through English. And that means that when we teach English, we should refrain from using Norwegian. Now, many pupils will be frustrated if you just speak English to them. And I met with many teachers that I know it's impossible to just use English. But it's quite amazing to see what pupils can actually learn if you just take time to explain things, if you slow down, if you use a lot of non-verbal communication, or if you use drawings and flashcards and other ways of supporting what you say. It's quite amazing to see what pupils can pick up. And as you all know, there are thousands of examples of children who have had to go abroad and who have started learning the foreign language even if they didn't know anything when they came there. They have to move to another culture, move to another country, and they just have to learn by picking up the language as they go. So of course it's possible to learn a foreign language even if you don't understand all the words that you are presented to. So, and please also notice that this is the first point that Munden and Myhre put up. So I will strongly advise you to use as much English as possible when teaching English. And also this idea of English now and then, because there is so little time devoted to English during the week. So Munden and Myhre say you should take every opportunity to speak a little bit of English. With, first graders, second graders, you can use English every day. I mean, rather than say, åpne bøkene på side 3, you can say, pick up your books, open your book on page 3. Or, let's have some lunch. Or, you can sing a song at the end of the day in English. So to use it every now and then, to give them a little bit of English every day. Then there is this principle of showing what words mean. And this can be as simple as illustrating what you're saying by pointing or showing. Can you find a pencil? Can you find a pencil? We are going to write. You need a pencil to write with. And then there is this idea of learning by doing, that pupils are allowed to act out or to do what they are, or to do things related to the language used. And this also relates to this next point, learning by playing, that we can play games, sing songs. We can use Simon Says, Kongen befaler, to learn the words by acting out. This is doing and playing. Then there is language in chunks, which can also be which is very relevant, that we don't just use learn singular words or words in isolation, but that we learn them in chunks, such as to take a shower, to use phrases as more than enough, or a phrase like to make a mistake. It's quite common to hear Norwegians saying to do a mistake, which is logical. We say gjøre en feil, but in English it should be make a mistake. So to use such chunks is very important. That's very much relevant to language learning. Then there is repetition in routines, that we repeat things over and over, as the behaviorists say, to reinforce the language learning, that things are repeated, and that we have routines for doing things can be very, very relevant. Then there is this idea of the learning spiral, which quite simply means that we try to build on what the pupils know from before. So we take what they know from before and we take this as a starting point for learning something new. And this is in line with cognitive learning theory, that the pupils, they build new cognitive structures on the basis of their old ones. Then there is the importance of transparency. We can try to use words that are similar in Norwegian and English, such as start and stop and bank and introduce. These are words that will be similar in English and Norwegian or in other languages. English here and there. We can also use English inside the school building, outside the school building, when the pupils are having physical education, gym. So use English in different locations. Also remember that motivation matters. It's important to motivate pupils to learn. But also don't overdo it. We shouldn't always focus on motivation. Sometimes the pupils need to learn that sometimes we need to do things that are boring. That's life. We have to prepare them for life. And the same thing relates to the last point. Smiles and praise are, of course, extremely important, but it can also be overdone. And pupils are sometimes quick to find out if you actually mean what you're saying. I've had loads of pupils coming to me saying, yeah, he's a nice teacher, but he praises you all the time and he doesn't really mean it. So it should be used, but it should be used wisely. Finally, I want to have a word on deep learning. Dybdelæring. This is going to be one of the main features of the new curriculum. So this is something that we should focus on. Stein Ludvigsen, who was very much involved in developing the precursors to the new curriculum, he talks a lot about deep learning. He's a professor of education at the University of Oslo, and he refers to Sawyer, who compares deep learning with sort of surface learning or traditional classroom learning, where he says that traditionally in classrooms, learners, they treat course material as unrelated to what they already know. And remember what we said about Munden Myhre. A good way of learning more deeply is that learners are allowed to relate new ideas and concepts to previous knowledge and experience. Similarly, it's quite typical in traditional classroom learning settings, according to Sawyer, that learners treat course material as disconnected bits of knowledge, whereas deep learning would much more focusing on integrating knowledge into interrelated conceptual systems. So when you're working with grammar, for example, you should try to link the different concepts together so that they make meaning on the overall level. Then, in the old days, there was a lot of focus on memorizations and learning by heart. This is usually not so good for deep learning, according to research. So Sawyer says, rather than memorizing facts and carry on procedures without understanding how and why, learners should look for patterns and underlying principles. What are the underlying principles of this or that? And then there is research showing that sometimes learners, they find it difficult to make sense of new ideas that are different from what they find in the textbooks. But we should try to teach our pupils to evaluate new ideas and to relate them to conclusions, to think critically about new ideas and how they relate to different concepts and how they relate to the conclusions that we draw. There has been this tradition that learners, they treat facts and procedures as something which is static. This is knowledge which is universal and everlasting, and which is told by some authority, a professor or some pundit or expert that knows this, and this is something that we had to treat as a sort of an eternal fact. But according to Sawyer and others, knowledge very often develops over time. So learners should be allowed to examine the logic of an argument critically. What is the logic of this argument? Is this valid? Is this believable? Is this truthful? And therefore we should teach them to think critically. Finally, there is this idea again of learning by heart or memorization, that learners memorize without reflecting on the purpose or on their own learning strategies. This is not so good for deep learning, according to Sawyer. Rather, learners should be allowed to reflect on their own understanding. How do I understand this? Why do I understand it like this? And they should reflect on their own process of learning. This, of course, relates to what we've said earlier about learning strategies, that they should be taught about learning strategies. Now, as you can see, learners will will need to be at a certain cognitive level in order to be able to do this. So I think it may be difficult for first graders, second graders, perhaps third graders to think like this in terms of, evaluating ideas, examining logic, thinking critically and so on. perhaps that's more for 6th, 7th graders. But still, to try to relate new ideas to previous ideas, to look for patterns and principles, these are things that we can work with even with very young pupils. Okay, that's what I wanted to say here. You can look more about, sorry about this, yeah, you can look more about the references at the end. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.